Carbon emissions and sequestration, MnDOT's cost savings and accident reduction with living snow fences and standing corn, and also the payment calculator given by Dave Smith. So when we get to that point, I'm going to have Dave come up and present that topic, and then I'm going to come back and then talk about the overall recommendations and discussion. Background, many of you probably understand the system of windbreaks and how they work, but obviously there's living snow fences are a type of windbreak that has trees or shrubs involved and slow down the high winds and blowing and drifting snow. Blowing and drifting snow is known in Minnesota and a major problem in winters, except for this winter, but obviously we're coming out of two severe winters in 2010, 2011. On the average, the Minnesota Division of Emergency Management has calculated about an average of 8 fatalities per year due to blowing and drifting snow in the state. And living snow fences save time, money, and lives. MnDOT has been involved with a memorandum of understanding since 2008, involving several government agencies in working with farmers to allow practices of living snow fences to take place on their land. Some of these USDA offices, the Farm Service Agency Office, the Soil Water Conservation Districts, also MnDOT staff, and then the Natural Resource Conservation Service. Just to explain some of these contracts, usually there's a corn-soybean rotation. That's the C and SB rotation on your screen. In southern Minnesota, that's a corn-soybean rotation. We don't have corn on corn in many areas of the state, so the protection is only available 1 year out of 2. We paid, historically, the MnDOT has paid $1.50 over market price, and based on averages of the average bushels per acre. The corn market price per bushel varies, and obviously in 2005 we have $1.45, and 2011 was $6.50. And obviously yields from 150 bushels to almost 220 right now in the state. So the reason for this discussion and work with this project is developing a payment calculator to help MnDOT look at the opportunities of what to pay farmers for these practices on their landscape. Living snow fences with government programs. The CRP program is a major program which the government pays farmers for conservation reserve programs for living snow fences, and that's certainly an opportunity for farmers to look at. And then the incentive with MnDOT's paying maintenance payments and incentives to those encompasses a little bit more acceptability to those particular programs. This is a slide showing standing corn rows. This is actually on Highway 30, north of Mountain Lake. And obviously you have 6 to 8 rows of standing corn, and obviously it does catch a lot of snow, protecting the roadway to the left of the screen. This is obviously a living snow fence of a honeysuckle shrub, single row, protecting the same highway of Minnesota Highway 30, north of Windham, just further west from the corn row. And this is about an 8-foot tall shrub row. This is my son when he was about 6th grade. The number of MnDOT contracts peaked at 2004 to 2005 with 40 contracts. It started in 2001, 2002 with 17 contracts, and the payment was $2.75. That was $1.50 over the current bushel price. 2010-11, 18 contracts was $7 per bushel because of the increase in corn price, or $700 per acre. So you can notice the increase in the payment prices. 2011, the total contracts came up to $50,974. Living snow fence contracts with the trees is about 68 contracts since 1992. These contracts have been worked with MnDOT and with the federal agencies to try and get these lands in the CRP, Conservation Reserve Program, and that contract is a 10 to 15-year contract. So obviously the longevity of that particular landscape is protecting the highway for that long time. The total length is up to 22 miles, 22 miles, total acres of 260, and the price for that in 2011 was $42,786. MnDOT has identified 3,700 snow problem areas in the state with a median length of 755 feet. Blowing and drifting snow, here's some scenes from the state. If you live in the metro area, you probably don't see a lot of these scenes, but obviously our rural residents experience these on an annual basis in the wintertime usually. This winter is an exception. Living snow fences have a phenology. They do protect the roadway and drift on either side, on the windward side and on the leeward side of the snow protection planting. Obviously, you see in that second down slide with a tree, deciduous trees don't leave a lot of drifting potential because the snow blows right underneath it. So we do want low cover like a shrub row or a conifer type planting, pines or spruce to be in the planting. And usually most people are acceptable of one row. You see the picture of a red osier dogwood planting there with a MnDOT worker in it, and obviously very deep, and that's about a 40-50 foot row there, and that's a CRP planting. Our project encompassed survey methods of both agencies, online agency questionnaires with survey questionnaire with open and closed-end questions. We developed and administered the SurveyMonkey, and then also we had separate surveys for MnDOT and then the separate agency surveys. We also surveyed the focus groups of landowners in about 5 locations, used the funnel sequence question route, and then we sampled the existing farmers that do have contracts with MnDOT. Of those, MnDOT staff, 42 returned the surveys, and the agency staff of FSA and NRCS and SWCDs, we had 118 return their surveys. Focus groups were 45 landowners. Results of MnDOT staff, 90% of respondents were promoting the Living Snow Fence program. Respondents use a variety of multiple promotion techniques from talking to landowners, soliciting landowners, using media outlets, etc. I've thrown in a few different slides here just to remind you that it does snow and blow in Minnesota because we are not experiencing that this winter. And some of the result questions for MnDOT staff we'll do first. How confident are you that living snow fences are effective at reducing snow and ice removal costs? You see that the majority of the surveys mentioned that they were somewhat to very confident that living snow fences reduce snow and ice removal costs. How confident are you that living snow fences are effective in reducing crashes? And obviously about the same number, very confident to somewhat confident that MnDOT staff is reporting that they do believe in living snow fences in the landscape. This is an interesting photograph. It shows the blow ice situation right before a living snow fence, and this is in Minnesota. So as we talked throughout the program today, and even Dave when talking about the payment calculator, when we talk about blow ice, this is the blow ice situation where we have some meltdown and some blowing across the roadway with blowing snow, and then maybe the sun's melting in the snow and then refreezing at night and so forth. But you see almost dry pavement where the snow is being protected by the living snow fence or highway. Another question for MnDOT staff: do you have the technical knowledge and skills and ability of how living snow fences function and promote their use with MnDOT and agency partners? And a lot of them do agree or strongly agree. So most of the MnDOT staff do have the proper knowledge to promote living snow fences. We asked them constraint questions, and the pie chart here shows that is there a constraint? Do you face constraints promoting MnDOT living snow fences? And it looks like almost 70%, 75% do say that there is some constraints. And in the other bar chart, obviously we're looking at probably the most restrictive one. Most constraining is the lighter blue, which is the second from the right, is the lack of time of the work on the program. Also insufficient funding is one of the major problems. You see the lack of knowledge is not a problem, least constraining, as mentioned in the previous slides on the review of their knowledge. Lack of knowledge is not restraining. It's funding and then time to work on the project. Does your MnDOT district have the equipment and materials, labor, expertise necessary to plant a living snow fence? And kind of a 50-50 break, 47 yes, 53 no. This was a question looking at maintenance and looking at planning. This next question is on maintenance. Does your MnDOT district have equipment, materials, and trained staff or workforce available for annual maintenance of living snow fence on private lands? And here's kind of a break. It looks like most of them were either neutral or disagree. So it looks like a lot of the MnDOT staff that were surveyed, that returned their survey, really didn't have the resources available to do maintenance. And that was one of our questions in the survey that we wanted to find out. Yes?
If I could ask, when you talk about, I'm sorry. I thought I'd ask this question right now. When you talk about having the equipment materials, are we talking about permanent living snow fences, or are we talking about the temporary, the crop rotation?
Yes, these would be the living snow fences with the shrub rows or the trees, the semi-permanent, yes, not the corn rows. Very good question. Thank you, Ken. Another question we thought we'd ask is about the GIS snow trap inventory. Do you use the GIS snow trap inventory to identify blowing, drifting snow? And this was interesting that we found a large percentage that didn't really hear about it or didn't know about it. And some 10% don't use it, but obviously about 55% use it. So there's a good share, 30% that do not know about the GIS snow trap inventory. Now we'll move on to the agency staff surveys. We surveyed Farm Service Agency, also Soil Water Conservation Districts, Natural Resource Conservation Service. 118 staff returned their surveys. A majority of promoting living snow fences. The program was rated average in terms of priorities, 56%, so just over 50%. Obviously, these particular agencies do a lot more other programs, conservation work, than just living snow fences. Majority, 60% agree or strongly agree that they have required technology or technical knowledge of the program, and then 36 feel the agency is equipped to do the plantings. A lot of the SWCDs in each county in Minnesota usually do plantings, or at least supply trees for their residents. Another agency staff a survey. Have you met with the MnDOT Living Snow Fence Coordinator this year to prepare living snow fence plans? And it looks like many of them have not. So here's certainly, and we'll bring up this in recommendations, certainly a need for our SWCD staff to be aware of our MnDOT staff that do have living snow fence coordinators in their district. Have you ever been invited to participate in a road safety audit to look at ways to reduce crashes? And obviously many of them have not. So these are agencies that maybe we should involve in some type of safety talks, especially regarding snow and drifting snow and living snow fences around the state. Agency staff, how familiar are you in the Towards Zero Death mission to create a culture for which traffic fatalities and serious injuries are no longer acceptable? Very little of the population that responded back know about this particular Towards Zero Death mission. And again, maybe more educational programs need to be directed at these agencies and agency staff. And actually, most of the agency staff felt that their role to play in reducing vehicle crashes were not apparent and not visual, which is interesting. But you got to remember that most of these staffs are doing other types of jobs, other programs, other conservation practices. But living snow fences certainly is a life-improving and safety measure that we could do in rural Minnesota. Focus groups. Now we're going to switch to the landowner focus groups. We had 45 individual landowners participate in January and February of 2010. We identified cost constraints, factors positively influencing adoption. The most frequently mentioned were the life cycle costs of living snow fences, including implementation, maintenance, rejuvenation, and removal costs. Now, hopefully we won't remove the trees once they're planted, but that was one of the concerns. Opportunity costs, also costs related to changing land values, and compensation is insufficient. Now, obviously, the changing land values over the last 5 years have been extreme in southern Minnesota and around the state and really around the country, increasing in price. Focus groups, constraints, risk, the plant mortality, plant death, and the landowner was responsible for replacing those particular plants, so that was a hassle and a problem with constraint with acceptance. The hassle factor of farming around these particular plantings and the shrub rows that are planted in a cornfield or soybean field, and then farming around it. Time restraint to maybe harvest after the planting and so forth, or just maybe reduction of yield potentially around the planting. Contract length rigidity, seemed like a lot of the people wanted some flexibility in the contracts, lack of adjustment and changing values of land prices and so forth. There are no really universal variables influencing adoption of living snow fences. Literature shows many different factors do influence adoption, and landowner discussion several of these factors. Awareness of the program, personal local contacts, and targeted recruitment was really paramount. If the landowner knew the plow driver come up to the farmer and told them what severe drifting problem this is in front of their landscape, and said a living snow fence would help eradicate that, then there was much more acceptance with that. Relative advantage and also perception of the program that promotes the landowner objectives. If the landowner felt that they were getting something in return or they were benefiting from that living snow fence themselves, then they certainly were willing to adopt the program. And incentives and compensation certainly were variables that they considered in adopting those particular contracts. Cost to the landowner, this was our cost factor of identifying costs for living snow fences, which is the trees and shrubs, versus the standing corn rows. A living snow fence, certainly the cash rent, maintenance, you're taking land out of production, you're planting shrubs, and you're not planting corn to an annual crop there. Maintenance of the shrubs or the trees, inconvenience, possible yield reduction around the fence on both sides of the fence. Although there's differing viewpoints and research showing different advantages to a living snow fence as well in yields, and establishment costs. Standing corn rows have been identified to have a lost crop value, inconvenience. The lost crop value is for farmers that just leave their corn standing and not harvest it. They can hand harvest it, they just have to leave the corn stalk standing. So we're obviously encouraging a lot of landowners to have the FFA boys and girls or 4-H clubs to come out and maybe hand pick the corn. They can still get the benefits of the harvest. It's just that coming back and the hassle factor of inconvenience coming back in the spring and tilling that corn, standing corn stalks up and then preparing the plant to plant the next year. Maintenance costs we have bracketed down into different levels here. Watering certainly is paramount the first 2 years. Then it goes to mowing. The first 4 years of these tree plantings are critical, and shrub plantings. Replanting would be the second year after death loss. Spot spraying maybe for weeds would be another factor, another cost. And then hand picking weeds is another factor. So these are documented in our report as well. This is certainly an example that we don't want to see out on the landscape. This is a poor example of maintenance. Very weedy particular planting. You see 2 rows are planted here of shrubs, and obviously the landowner did not manage correctly weed control. So obviously a lot of foxtail, a lot of other weeds are growing out of the holes where the shrubs are growing, and certainly competition the first year is going to be leading to a lot of mortality, death of these plants. So this is a poor example, but obviously shows a picture of using a weed fabric that many of our farmers are using. And then also it's showing the Conservation Reserve Program, maybe CRP grasslands being planted on either side of that landscape that can be enrolled in a government program for 15 years. Landowner opportunity costs. The rent certainly is increasing as well as the land values. Inconvenience of farming around these particular practices. Maintenance of the trees and shrubs. Obviously very much a concern on landowners' minds. And then yield reduction around the fence, which again, I say some of the research varies, but obviously their concern is the yield factor. And here's a good example of a nice planting that's been well managed, mowed, and cared after. Obviously these are red cedar plants. To the left of the screen there's some shrub plants, and also weed fabric is laid down, and well managed the first couple of years, and going to be a good start off for those particular trees. Establishment costs per acre. You see by the pie chart, the main cost is the weed mat, and then tree plantings and seedlings is really a minor part of that particular cost. Native grasses, depending on the landscape that's being planted, native grasses and grass seeds do cost a lot of money. Tillage, grass plantation, herbicides, and then fixing the line is basically surveying those particular properties for those plantings. This is a landowner you see the car on the road that's protecting a highway. This is a nice little picture from MnDOT, and thank you, Dan, for this photograph. This showing in the first part of the screen some berry plants, and that's American cranberry. And then he's got some lilacs that are planted there, certainly flowering lilacs, be it pollinators and so forth, adding to the environment and the landscape. And then over the top of the farmer's head is the flowering dogwoods. These are red osier dogwoods. So he's got a 2-row densely planted, alternating planting, kind of a wildlife planting of living snow fence shrub row there that's very effective. And then he's got CRP that's planted from that particular planting to the roadway. that's getting paid government payment for that for a 15-year contract. Minimum payments to landowners. Obviously, they get the CRP contract if lands are enrolled in the CRP. Not all lands are, but if they're enrolled in the CRP payment, that's constant throughout the length of the contract. And then MnDOT has some enticement for maintenance, some incentives, prices the first couple of years, and then obviously tailing down the 4th year, but then kind of coming back to the 15th year. Part of the study was on carbon emissions and sequestration. We wanted to estimate the avoidance of emissions by having living snow fences, the reduction of plowing, snow plows and so forth on the road. Also the payments or the value to landowners through carbon sequestration and storage. Obviously most plants, if not all plants, have carbon sequestration possibilities and storage in the environment. Even corn plants do. And there's stored carbon in the soil. But obviously living snow fences do provide carbon sequestration. And then obviously, on the other hand, as we do plow down the roads with large equipment taking fuel, they are emitting greenhouse gases. And this is also implemented in the payment calculator, as Dave will talk about a little later. Just a couple charts, and we have more information on our final report. But this is a chart from Nebraska showing that there is some carbon sequestration in several agroforestry plantings, living snow fences, and then field windbreaks. There was a carbon credit program in 2003 to 2009 through the Chicago Climate Exchange, where farmers and landowners actually got paid money for these particular plantings. Actually, that program ended in 2010, but living snow fences were receiving $2 to $5 per acre. That's not a lot of money, but that is a ecosystem services payment. So I think in the future, depending on our government and state government and federal government, there might be some future ecosystem service payments that our landowners can benefit from in these living snow fence projects and plantings. We also wanted to analyze roadways that comparatively had living snow fence on them and then did not. And we looked at MnDOT service maintenance plow drivers for that information to determine measurable economic benefits in installing living snow fences. We looked at the possibility of getting their data from the plow drivers, but right now the existing data does not allow precise estimates of maintenance costs. It's reported per plow route by drivers, and then at this point in time, MnDOT is actually applying the AVL automated vehicle locator system or equipment, and that's becoming more prevalent in a lot of the snow plows. And hopefully that will be much more improved than what was for this project. We really couldn't utilize a lot of the data that we had received from some of those plow drivers and plow equipment operators that had the AVL equipment, but we think that will come. However, our team of living snow fence project team members did develop a procedure to use with the AVL data. So through this study, some of our researchers on campus developed a way to gather that AVL data and then how to formulate it in a computer program that would be logical to look at. So documentation of roadway data, benefits of living snow fences from drivers' perspectives. Certainly more AVL data and roadway data is needed to quantify and confirm anecdotal evidence of living snow fence protection and benefits. Now, the transportation agency costs, snow drifting and then blow ice. We looked at those two categories. In snow drifting events, number of events, snow drift size, the snow removal equipment, use, time, cost, mobilization from the site to the station or from the station to the site. Blow ice, and these are some factors looking at the payment calculator that Dave's going to talk about soon. The number of events, sand, salt application, the rate, the mixture, the cost, and again the mobilization from the truck station to the site. Obviously there's a lot of cost involved in extra equipment and moving snow in these locations, especially for snow drifts. Caterpillars have to be hired and equipment rented and so forth to move snow away from the roadway and prevent from another blowing snow event. And that was just compounded continually in 2010 and 11. Here's a scene from one of the rural Faribault County roadways that were blown in with snowdrift problems. Reduction in cost to treat blow ice. Obviously, the salt is a big factor of maintenance expense. Sand is fairly relatively cheap, but doesn't melt the snow. And then it was estimated that the application rate was 300 pounds per lane mile. Another scene of blow ice, a little bit of visibility issues there too. MnDOT benefits, it looks like the equipment cost, there wasn't, they look like 60% of the equipment cost was not that much, it was zero. It looked like the sand and salt really kicked in at the 0 to 500. And then there was about 10% to 15% of the cost of equipment stretched out to upwards to $5,000. And this was annual benefits. We just want to look at some of the safety factors of accidents and costs. These are national studies with the U.S. Transportation Studies, and this was for Minnesota. And looking at the fatalities, it was $7 million they figured from 1995 to 2005, 64 accidents, and then so forth. Those categories are also figured in the payment calculator. We wanted to focus on this particular study. There was a couple different studies by the National Transportation Database looking at reduction of snow fences at 8%. Snow fence reduction of accidents was 20% by the URS report. And then a researcher in 1982 looked at visibility, was 70% reduction of accidents with a living snow fence. And a snow fence on super elevated curves by MnDOT actually studied 40% reduction in accidents by their study. And I've got a few slides on that. There's a honeysuckle planting on the left side by the hill, and certainly protecting that roadway of a super elevated curve. And then this was the study done in MnDOT. You can see that the darker blue is before the living snow fence installation, and then the lighter blue is after the snow fence installation. And you see that the fatal crashes on the far left certainly was almost 42%, I believe, and then down to almost 2%. So certainly it is protecting the roadways. And that's what maybe we would suggest, that these super elevated curves be targeted first for living snow fences. Another photo of elevated curve. Again, accidents reduced by 40% with living snow fence protection on super elevated curves. Transportation benefits on the percent snow of problem areas. And this is the accident benefits. And then the driver's time was evaluated too, at almost at 0 to 500, almost 80% of the time. Certainly would be beneficial for living snow fences to protect time on the driver. And then the accident levels at the 10% level. I'm going to introduce Dave Smith, our research assistant and graduate student that's been working on the project, and he's going to now talk about the payment calculator. Dave? Oh, you got you.
All right, thanks for having us here today, and I'm going to talk more in detail about the payment calculator. The goal of the payment calculator is to have a cost-benefit analysis tool that can be used to look at these specific sites. So we mentioned that there's 3,700 snow problem areas in Minnesota, and we did kind of lay out some of the cost and transportation benefits kind of on a global average basis over Minnesota. But now we have some indications of where it might be beneficial to put these snow fences. We wanted to give MnDOT a tool so that they could look at specific sites and use specific data and do a full analysis of their usage of equipment, the amount of traffic that goes through that area, and the accident reductions. So we wanted to integrate this with the MnDOT Snow Problem Database, which is a database that was collected using field surveys. So this was the data that built the snow problem areas and collected data such as exactly where the snow problem area is, the mile point marker, how long the snow problem area is, then looked at what are the snow and ice related accidents that occur in that area. We also wanted the tool to be functional beyond MnDOT, so we were building the tool for MnDOT, but we had this desire of other transportation agencies within Minnesota and in other states to use this tool, and so we wanted to create a tool that was usable beyond MnDOT. And also this is related to snow problem areas which aren't identified in the field surveys. We wanted MnDOT to be able to use the tool for those. We also wanted the tool to be usable too. We want to be user friendly so that people would actually end up using the tool, and that it wouldn't make the task of doing these analyzing these snow problem areas to be too big. So we incorporated a lot of different databases into this project and into the calculator, and part of the reason for that is to bring in data so that the user doesn't have to go out and find all this data when they're running the analysis. And so this includes corn yields, equipment costs from MnDOT, the field survey database that we used, snow-related accident data, which MnDOT put together of snow and ice-related accidents around the snow fence, the amount of traffic going through the area, the soil rental rate, so that's if the project was in a CRP land, what would the FSA's share of the payment be, and also looking at the land values, the land rent, because that varies from different areas in the state. So the first piece here, there's a lot kind of busy going on here, but in order to start using the calculator, you need to know, you need to find the particular snow problem that you want to look at. And so we have two tools for doing that. The first tool is this map here of Minnesota. And so this map has all 3,700 snow problems on it, and you can't see that because we had to make them so small. So what you do is when you zoom in here, and this is this zoomed in version here, you zoom in there and you can see these unique identifiers here, although they're kind of washed out. But you can see the unique identifiers here, and you can use those unique identifiers here in this segment ID. And so if you put that information and that segment ID in there, it will automatically draw in all the information that's available for that. If you don't have that information, you can put in information that you do know, such as the roadway number, district, county, what truck station it is, and there's a button there to filter the list. And so here behind here you see this is an example of a filtered list. So this is for this particular I-90, you filter the list, you ended up with 30 snow problem areas, and it tells you what the milepost mileage from and to, and the true mileage from and to. And so that if you are looking to locate a particular segment where you don't have the segment ID, you can use that to locate it. And I should note here, there's a legend here that we use throughout the calculator. The bright yellow is that it's user input and it's blank, so it's kind of as a very striking highlighting to the user to say this information has not been inputted. You should input it, and if you don't, then that information won't be considered in the calculation. The green, it changes to green after you input a value in there. Also, we have some suggested. Is there a pointer? Oh, there you go. Okay. Yep. And there's the orange is the suggested value, so that's the information that's drawn in from the database. And I'll talk a little more about that. And then the red is just you have no ability to change or adjust it. It's just calculated for you, but just so you know that information is there. So the first part in the calculator is the design of the living snow fence and the standing corn rows. And so, as I mentioned before, we have these suggested information that's drawn in from the database. In this specific case, we didn't have the segment ID to draw a lot of that information in. Although once we input some of the information, like the county, that's able to start drawing from the database as far as for corn yields and land rental. So this orange section here is the suggested values. So and if you want to use that suggested value, you can copy that over, or you can override it or input your own value there. And so we have different sections on specifics about the snow problem areas, about the design of the snow fence, so how far is it going to be set back, how long does it need to be. And then we have two separate sections on design for the living snow fence. specific to that and specific to the standing corn rows. And then we just also ask some questions about a particular piece of land that you would be interested in inputting into this program, and that helps with calculating some of the payments, not for this CRP program, but there's also an EQIP program that can provide some of the cost share funds for installing these living snow fences. After you've input all the information, we built a design module here. So this allows you to, when you input all the information, it gives you a visual representation of the snow fence. So this is our particular snow fence here. It shows on the top what the living snow fence, and the bottom the standing corn rows, and this is all proportional to the actual measurements of the distance setback, the width, and the length here. We also have a link on here to the snow fence design module, which is actually a model that takes into account, uses the location to take into account weather data, so that information online can be used to help you design the snow fence. So how far are you going to set it back? How long is it going to be? All that type of information. Then the next piece is to we ask specific information about blow, ice, and drifting. So we have questions about how many events there are per year, what's the estimated speed reduction because of these events, how long does it take to regain bare pavement, what kind of equipment's used, and how long that equipment is used, and how much mileage that equipment has to go, how many miles that equipment has to go. And then we also ask questions about treatment, the application rate, and then the mixture of sand and salt. In the drifting section, we have a system in place where at each line you select a piece of equipment that's used in that particular drifting location. Then you specify the number of events where you use that equipment, the average number of pieces of equipment you're using at a time, and then the average equipment hours that's used. And you input all that information, and you can, for each line is for a new piece of equipment, and it will use that equipment code to automatically draw in cost information on that piece. So in addition to the costs to landowners and cost savings for MnDOT and the potential transportation savings, we also have installations costs associated with these. And so we have a suggested value, although you can input, like the other parts of the calculator, you can input your own value. We built this installation cost sheet to look really similar to the worksheets that are already used as part of this program, so that if you had one of these worksheets filled out, you could just take this worksheet and just go down, and all the items are numbered the same as they are on the worksheets, and there's actually an example of a worksheet right next to it, so you can clearly see which line from your worksheet goes to the calculator. In addition to the installation costs, we have establishment and maintenance. And the final output here, in addition, we have some sheets where we have some very, very detailed output, which is also available, but I'm not going to show that and go into that. We have, this is the output sheet here, and it basically shows the costs here. So this is the installation costs. What is the cost share from FSA, so from the conservation agencies? What's the total annual costs? What's the cost share for the annual cost share from the agency? In the next section we have here is the benefits. We have the snow and ice removal cost savings, the benefits to the transportation agency, and then this highlighted here is really for the transportation agency. It's kind of the most important piece of the whole calculator. It basically tells what are the net benefits to the transportation agencies. And so in this example here, you can see that those net benefits are actually negative. So in this particular planting here, there's not enough cost savings to justify the cost of the planting as a direct benefit just to the transportation agency. And of course, the transportation agency is also concerned about safety and safety and mobility, and so we need to also consider those costs in addition to that. And so the next line here talks about the benefits to society or the transportation benefits. And those are pretty huge. And the reason why is because in this particular site, there's a lot of snow and ice related accidents. There's a lot of traffic here. This is I-90, so it's a very busy road. And so any slowdown in traffic because of blow ice or drifting conditions will cause substantial economic impact. So the way to look at this particular site is it may not have direct positive net benefits to MnDOT, but for $300 a year net cost to them, there would be about $225,000 in transportation savings to society. So it's probably in an area where those they would want to look at putting this snow fence. And so these pie charts here just kind of, and we have the same thing for standing corn rows here. I won't go through that. Then we have these pie charts here that just kind of show the breakdown. So how much is the savings? This red area here is from the savings from reducing drifting, from blow ice, kind of what are the different types of areas of savings in blow ice and drifting. What are the economic benefits? A lot of these benefits come from accident reductions because there's some accidents in this particular location. Here some very serious accidents, and so that reduces or that's a benefit as far as reducing accidents. Then we break down the installation costs and the annual costs. In addition to these economic numbers, we also give an output here, which you can't see. It's a 15-year total, which has physical information about. So what are over 15 years? How many different categories of accidents are you reducing? How much hours of driver time are you saving? How much avoided sand and salt, and all the equipment and the carbon sequestered in using this particular piece. Because there's such an extensive snow problem area in Minnesota, and so if MnDOT were to analyze all these snow fences, there would potentially be, because the way this calculator is built, we built it so that it's a single Excel file, so it's very easily transportable from one person to the next. And so because of that, all the databases are in this Excel file. It's also a macro-enabled Excel file because we had to build some macros to do what we wanted to do. So it's a fairly large file, so that if we saved every single snow fence, it would take up a lot of storage. And so what we did with that is we created the ability to save a working copy, which is just basically a copy with your inputs in the calculator. Or we have to just save the inputs and the results, and to get rid of kind of all that background database and all those macros and stuff. And so that those non-working copies, and so once you kind of have a final analysis done, that will use about 83% less storage space. So we think that will help with managing the data and with potentially a really large data set. So now I'm going to give it back to Gary to talk about the conclusions and recommendations.
Thank you, Dave. Great job. As you can see, we've got a great graduate student working on the payment calculator. We think it's very functional, and still editing a little bit. So you out there on listening to the webinar, if you're county engineers that want to look at the opportunity of testing it in your county, certainly contact us, and we'll look at the opportunity of sharing that with you. And even other states have thought about using it too. Now we want to get into real quickly the part of the program that I think most of you might be interested in is our recommendations for MnDOT and some other opportunities for improvement of living snow fence projects in the state of Minnesota. A contract length, the issue is obviously when landowners sign up for a living snow fence contract, they usually sign up for a fixed rental rate and the length of contract. Recommendation would be to look at contracts that be written and built in a periodic adjustment every 1 to 5 years based on land value changes and so forth. Contract length could be shortened, but that creates a risk of the landowner maybe getting out of that particular contract and not renewing. Increased payments based on inflation rate, have a fixed historical inflation rate or adjustable public index inflation rate tied to those contracts. Regarding maintenance costs and uncertainty, the issue is in certain contracts, landowners are responsible for maintaining a living snow fence or making sure the vegetation survives. Obviously, there's been some problems with that. Landowners are not really familiar with maybe some of those maintenance type of functionalities of living snow fences and how to control weeds. Obviously, they know how to grow corn and soybeans, but not to control weeds in those particular circumstances. Maybe look at hiring a contractor, provided maintenance on the planting, and then obviously reduce the payments to the individual farmer or landowner. Cover the cost of tree removal at the end of the contract if the landowner wants to eradicate the planting. MnDOT should ensure that all potential maintenance activities required over the length of the contract are covered, and then higher payments for the first 3 to 4 years, and then lower after that. The fetch area, the snow catch area in between the planting and the roadway, when living snow fences are implemented, there's a strip of field that's between the living snow fence and the roadway, usually 100 feet or more, and it's difficult for the farmer to prepare and cultivate. Obviously, as seen in some of the previous slides, the farmers have put that into CRP payments, which is really nice. It's also wildlife habitat and protects the soil, and a lot of individuals are looking at that. The strips could also be potentially used for biomass or wildlife plantings. Incentive payments, there are some discussion of how incentives might be providing landowners. Such stretches of roadway would be priority for the MnDOT. So you want to prioritize these roadways, looking at 10 to 20% increase over the opportunity cost, maybe for super elevated curves, as we mentioned before in the presentation, maybe the high accident area, as Dave mentioned in his example. Maybe on those particular sites, you want to increase the payments 10 to 20%. MnDOT will have will have to determine what kind of per acre payment or utilization of fixed and variable cost per those sites, but maybe prioritize targeted sites that you want to have living snow fences on and protect the roadways. Benefits and opportunities: living snow fence provided community wildlife and carbon, reduced wind erosion, moisture retention, and screens. Potential benefits for living snow fences should be included in promotional materials that are shared with landowners and communities, associated with benefits of motivating landowners to adopt living snow fence practices. Targeted landowners: obviously we need to focus on maybe those particular roadways and individuals that we might want to group together. So recommendations might be more coordinated effort in the needed of targeted landowners and groups of landowners, maybe a certain roadway that needs to be protected. So a number of landowners maybe need to be grouped together and then worked on together to make those contracts work and establish those living snow fences in those properties. Who should promote the program? The issue is there are many opportunities to use landowners with living snow fences, plow drivers, and others to help promote living snow fences. So use the farmers that have really benefited from living snow fences, help them promote the program. Also plow drivers that have worked with landowners to get that involved too. And MnDOT should consider some kind of incentive payment maybe on other support to those individuals. Clear, complete presentation. Obviously, some landowners don't know what they're getting paid until they actually sign the contract at these federal offices. So maybe have a clear and concise message of what the farmer would get paid, working with the federal agencies and also MnDOT staff. And right up front, when the first initial contact happens, this is what we're willing to pay, and this is how it would happen. So be forward thinking and be prepared to address that way. Role of agencies and service providers: agencies must be able to coordinate and work with landowners to promote implementation of living snow fences. All agency staffs work together. Obviously, it seems like some of the MnDOT staff that's living snow fence coordinators were not working, or vice versa, were not working with SWCDs or NRCS in those counties. The agencies did not know who the contact were. Hopefully, we can develop a relationship in those counties that they know who the contact person is and work together to establish more living snow fences on those targeted areas in the state. And then agencies become more familiar with the Towards Zero Deaths program. Making use of AVL data as AVL data becomes more prevalent in MnDOT trucks around the state. Certainly, hopefully, the technology is going to be usable for that data. And then certainly another potential research study would be in the future to develop a research plan and that would allow MnDOT to use the data generated by these particular units and then look at the paired roadways of living snow fences versus non-living snow fences. Species of plantings: look at the effectiveness of living snow fences depends on having a fence tall enough to be able to capture the snow. There are a limited number of species that could be available. Most of the farmers are choosing shrubs. Landowner recommendations would be landowners should identify the goals of their plantings, created for the planning, looking at the opportunities and goals that they have for their farm. A lot of them are considering edible planting shrubs like hazelnuts, elderberry, black chokeberry, American plum, serviceberry, and more. MnDOT should also consider maybe fast-growing willows as a way to establish effective living snow fences in a year's time and used for bioenergy. Some follow-up research and outreach. Again, AVL Data Use. There could be another research project on the use of gathering that information that's gathered from the snowplow trucks that do have AVL equipment and do some studies on living snow fences versus non-living snow fence areas of roadway. Outreach to counties. Certainly we're going to reach to county engineers and show them the payment calculator, but also again, have agency staff work with MnDOT and SWCD's NRCS staff and make sure they communicate with each other and know who's working where and what those targeted snow problem areas are in the state, and targeted landowners work together to get those living snow fences on the ground. Outreach to other states, Iowa State and also Michigan have showed some interest. Bruce Wyatt is from the USDA in Washington, NRCS forester. He's interested in also looking at this program to share with some of the snow states in the upper Midwest. Future research, again, salt and chemical application has become an important issue. Assessment of the potential of current species of phytoremediation is needed. New species to consider that would grow in these conditions. AVL research, as we mentioned before, research of adoption based on recommendations. Maybe you could have a couple of counties do a door-to-door type assessment and type of research with some other avenue of adoption, or working with landowners and do some research-based information type studies that way. Also evaluate fast-growing willows plus natives and non-native shrubs that could be used for multiple purposes like food and biomass in Minnesota. One final note, and this was in our final note in our report, is based on a study and information available to our authors. MnDOT could see a net economic returns of over $1.3 million per year if 40% of those inventoried blowing and drifting snow problem sites were contracted to living snow fence practices, which is about 1,480 sites. And with that, we'll open up for questions. And our IT team mentioned there was maybe a glitch or not recording in the first couple minutes or first couple slides for our webinar audience. If there's a question of what was not said there or what was said there, let us know. Otherwise, I'll open it up for Joe or for the audience here for questions.
Has there been any thought of MnDOT actually owning a greater right-of-way and planning those ourselves?
I'm going to let Dan, and I'm involving our team and others in the room here too. Dan Gullickson, our MnDOT forester, I'm going to have him address that question. Very good question.
Hi, I'm Dan Gullickson, forester with MnDOT, and that is one of the tools to look at, is to acquire an easement, a snow fence easement, where the shrubs are planted. We have done that in the past, and this tool here could be used to look at, for example, if you're renting that land, what's that going to cost, and then you can see whether it might be just better just to buy that easement for the snow fence. However, one of the things dealing in the agricultural community is that a lot of landowners, they don't want to give up their property rights. They don't want to necessarily do an easement. They're maybe going to be more interested in doing an agreement, a contract like we have with the Conservation Reserve Program, a federal program through U.S. Department of Agriculture that basically says, as long as you have that conservation practice on the land, we'll pay you for 10 to 15 years. And so there is a comfort of having that type of a handshake contract rather than having something recorded at the courthouse that's tied to the land forever. Back in the 1930s through about 1960, MnDOT, when we were buying land for highway construction purposes, oftentimes MnDOT back in the 30s, 40s, 50s, and 60s would actually buy snow fence easements at the same time, saying that we were going to put up a temporary snow fence, put it up in the fall, those 4-foot tall type snow fencing, and then we'd take it down in the spring. But with the advances made with new snow removal equipment, we haven't been doing that since then. But we still have a lot of those easements that could potentially be sitting out there. But they would only be good for doing a seasonal type snow fence, meaning that you have to put it up in the fall and take it down in the spring so they could still work their land to grow crops. Did I answer your question for you? Okay.
Any other webinar questions coming online? I think you can
You have one.
actually print them.
Yes, question from online. Did the $1.4 million in annual net economic benefits to MnDOT include social benefits, or was that just net direct agency benefits?
I think that's the, Dave, can you, or Dan, do you know what the answer to that is?
Yeah, I can answer that. So I have the mic on. I got the my mic back on. So that was just the direct agency benefits, and so in the full report we did make an estimate of the benefits, the societal benefits, including the transportation benefits. So that figure was just the benefit to the transportation agency, and so that was based on the information that we had for a global average, and implementing it on 40% of the snow problem areas, because 40% is where we saw positive net economic benefits for the transportation agency.
So that's direct cost estimates of like labor and expense for salt and sand and so forth.
Yes.
Right? Yep. Very good question.
But we do recommend that the agency still do a more detailed analysis of each particular site to make sure that that site does have those benefits. So.
I had a question. I noticed in the slides where you were showing the initial plantings, how small some of those plantings were. Did you look at all when you were figuring the cost? I know you mentioned using different faster growing species, but do you think that you sort of optimize the size of the initial planting versus the cost? I mean, I know a lot of times to put in a bigger tree would cost more, but if it got you to a height quicker that it would catch the snow, did you look at all of that?
Sure. I may have Dean answer some questions on that, but actually we're finding that just anything in the landscape, well, a single row of shrubs is really going to be beneficial for a living snow fence. And farmers don't want to take too much land out of production, so if we can just at least get one planting of a single row out there, that's really good.
Bigger.
Yeah, oh, you were thinking maybe taller?
Yeah, put in, a 2-year-old shrub instead of a baby one.
Right. Dean, do you have a comment on that?
Yeah, we considered that, but it wasn't part of this particular research project.
Right.
But we looked at some of these willows that they use for biomass, and you can have a functioning snow fence in one season, basically. They'll grow 5 to 10 feet a year. So, but then you do have, sometimes you want to limit the height, so that's another thing. But we haven't done that calculation. That's actually something that would be interesting. And actually the cost of some of those plantings might even be less expensive than some of the current ones. The fast growing willows, basically it's a stick that you put in the ground and then it roots. So, very good question.
Yeah, very good question. Actually, those willows too could have multiple purposes, like biomass. We could have several rows of that. Maybe harvest one row one year and then and then leave it. Yes, rotational. Yes, very much so.
Yeah, I can just quick comment on that. For the snow fence payment calculator, we basically assumed that the snow fence was designed properly so that it was effective in the analysis that we did. But we did include this the height of a young snow fence in there, and so that during the first year we only have, I think, 25% of the benefits. Second year 50%, a third year 75%, and then the full benefits from then on. And I think the height, my understanding is the height is really matters is how much snow you get. So if you have a year where you get a lot of snow, then you do need that really high snow fence.
Right.
So.
Good point, Jim. Yeah, it's like 10 times the height of the planting is usually the formula that you use for snow catch area. So if it's a 4 foot, then 40 feet catch area will be the drift extension.
All right, I think we got time for one more.
Okay. Ken?
Very interesting presentation. Thank you. My question has to do with the corn rows, standing corn rows. So in a crop rotation, the farmer would only have the opportunity to put those in every other year.
Right.
First of all, are there implications for that, and any solutions that you've come up with as far as kind of a longer term, more permanent solution? And secondly, what is the sort of the optimal distance from the road to have those standing corn rows?
Maybe I'll answer the second question first. Usually about 200 feet or 250 feet is usually a good distance away. And that's kind of just a standard feet away. Also, Dan, I'm going to have you answer some of this too. We have actually 1 or 2 landowners that are planting corn into soybeans and a strip. And obviously they have to watch their herbicide, but actually we have a lot of, obviously corn and soybeans are herbicide ready, or excuse me, Roundup ready, and you can spray Roundup on both crops. So it's not a big factor anymore, whereas you used to have to plant or apply different herbicides for those 2 different crops. But right now we do have some producers that see the value of doing that and getting the payments from MnDOT to leave standing corn rows in soybean fields. But yeah, to that end, obviously trying to get those producers to plant a living snow fence like a shrub row to be a more semi-permanent type planting is probably best. Dan, do you have any other comments on that, or Dave?
I guess, obviously the best thing would be is to encourage them to plant the living snow fence, because we have that protection for, many years. But you're right, Gary. Working with those landowners that are willing to, rotate their crops, so they always have a bit of ground on there that's corn, that they can alternate the corn soybean, but they always have a little strip of that on their land. We do have one farmer who has done that, and that's really been a huge benefit for us. And in terms of setback, optimal setback for snow fences, it really varies across the state. That's the beauty of the research that we had with the University of Minnesota about 10 years ago, working with Dr. Mark Seeley, looking at our climate, our winter climate, and looking at our topography. In far western Minnesota, being set back, maybe 150 to 200 feet from the road is what we're probably having to be. But when we're in a forested area, in a more of an urban area, we may be able to be within 75 feet of the road or 50 feet of the road, because we don't have as much unsheltered distance for that wind to carry that snow. So that's the beauty of research, is to uncover some of these things, because there's no 2 snow fences or snow problem areas that are the same. And that's the beauty of looking at each site individually, looking at the economics of this research project to help see if we're getting a good investment, and also making sure that we're looking at that winter climate database so that we're designing these things properly.
All right, we've got one last question online, and then we're going to have to cut it off for a little bit over time here.
In calculating the benefits of carbon sequestration, what value did you give for a ton of carbon sequestered?
Ton of carbon sequestered. Dave, do you want to go ahead with that? You have that in the payment calculator, right?
Yeah, so we did build that into the payment calculator, and so we used a value of $43 a ton. I can't, the reference I can't, I don't remember right now, but we have it in the paper. So that's the value that we use, and you can see from the calculator we do explicitly say how much tonnage we're estimating and what that value is, so that if you using different values, you could look at different amounts. So.
Yep. And a lot of inputs in the payment calculator can be changed if we find more research in the future that changes some of those values, and obviously the value of expenses and so forth. Those can be changed in the payment calculator. So, very good. Thank you.
All right. Well, thanks, Gary, once again. And this is the final seminar of this semester. We'll see everybody back in fall. Thanks.
Thank you, Kim, and Connie for wishes. Yeah. We were ripping. Sorry about that, but.